the fact that we have multiple eyes and multiple identities.
Yeah. And for me, that's one of the interesting new developments in personality psychology. So it used to be the case that we think of personality.
Sandra, thank you so much for being here. It is a thrill. I got to see a TED Talk that you gave a few years ago, and so much more. It's nice to see it all come together in this book, Mindmasters. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
I want to start with the same questions I ask all of our guests. The first is just to get to know you a little bit personally. Could have nothing to do with your work or intellectual interests. Could you complete this sentence for me? If you really know me, you know that.
You should not approach me before I've had my first cup of coffee. I think you find that out really quickly.
Who's the Sandra that we meet before your coffee?
Before that, I'm just grumpy and not interested in anything. I think when you typically talk to me, I would say I'm curious, I'm excited, but just without coffee, there's nothing.
Gotcha. Great.
Yeah.
All right. And this is a podcast on strategy. So my question is going to be, and I've asked this question 140 times to 140 different experts, and we always get a different answer.
Yeah.
What's your definition of strategy?
It's funny because I asked the same question to one of my colleagues once, because I'm in the management group at Columbia Business School, and I was put on the strategy search committee, and I had no idea. So I asked them, like, what is strategy? And they told me it's all about trade-offs. Still didn't know. So I think the way that I think about strategy is essentially you need to figure out what you want and what you don't want, and then figure out the steps of how to get there given the constraints. So that's my simple version of strategy.
I like that. What you want and don't want. Love it. Thank you. So there's so much I want to dig into here, and we won't be able to cover all of it. But I think it's, kind of start with the definition of psychological targeting. Could you tell us what psychological? Yeah. It's a term that you coined.
Yeah.
And so makes so much sense now that I've thought about it. So tell us what is the definition?
Yeah, so the way that I think of psychological targeting is essentially two steps. One is how do we take the data that we generate every day, everything from social media to credit card spending to the data that gets captured by your smartphone, turn that into psychologically meaningful constructs. That could be anything from personality, moral values, leadership qualities, mental health scores. And then that as a first step, and then as a second step, how do we tap into some of these insights, into these psychological motivations, needs, preferences, to potentially shift the way that you think, feel, and behave?
Gotcha. And but it's becoming newly possible to do this differently than before, right? This is a big part. We're going to explore that, but just maybe at a high level, what has changed?
So, I
think
to
do this more.
It's a great question, because I think there's two almost waves in which this has changed. The first one is just the fact that we have all of this data, and that we then also had machine learning models that can take data and translate it into something like a psychological construct, and also distribution, right? So the fact that we can target people on Facebook, that we can send out content that is hyper personalized. That was the first wave, I would say. Second wave, and we might get to this more later, is AI. So AI has highly democratized it. I don't need a proprietary model anymore that translates something very specific into something else that's very specific. I can just pop something into ChatGPT and say, hey, here's the social media post of person X. What is their big five personality profile? What are their moral foundations? And then obviously also AI is incredible at taking some of these dimensions and creating content that speaks to someone who is extroverted, someone who is more impulsive, someone who is more neurotic. So that's a total second revolution, I would say.
Yeah, I understand. I hadn't thought of, I mean, you have the feedback loop, more information coming too, and then we have the customization loop. And AI being able to actually playing a role on both sides. Tell us a little bit about extrovert versus introvert. How do we know whether someone is one or the other?
It's a great question, and I'm just using them very liberally because technically, so they're part extroversion is part of the Big Five personality framework, and that has these five traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the way that they were developed is was trying to capture differences in the way that people think, feel, and behave. And they're very relatively pragmatic approximations, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
it kind of collapses the complexity of who you are into your more extroverted, more open-minded, and so on. And they're usually not thought of as dichotomy. So I said like extroverted, introverted. It's usually a continuum. So you can be extremely
Mm-hmm.
extroverted anywhere to extremely introverted. And extroversion is one that we just use quite a lot because it kind of distinguishes the way that we interact with our social environments. So it's relevant for quite a lot of behaviors, quite a like which jobs do you like, which music do you like, mental health. So it's just one of these dimensions that's just driving a lot of behavior.
Yes, right. So that's just one example.
Yeah.
But the way that I did it, I have done my MBTI test, and I
Mm.
know I'm a INFJ, and I took a test and I thought about
Yeah.
it and observed. But now the way that someone would know that I'm an introvert is is very different, right?
Yeah.
We talk about. So how can that be done?
Yeah. So it used to be, as you said, like you take a test. MBTI is actually a bit challenging because, as you said, it just dichotomizes, right? It puts you into one of these buckets. But essentially, instead of asking you questions, like extroversion questions would be, I talk to a lot of different people at parties. I'm the life of the party. I like socializing. I get energy from social interactions. So instead of asking you these questions, we can essentially just observe all of the traces that you leave as you interact with technology. So instead of asking you about whether you socialize with a lot of people, I can just see how often do you interact with other people by tapping into your phone sensors, for example, right? So just
Mm,
take your GPS location. I know exactly where you are. So I might know that you are spending the night in a busy pub where there's usually a lot of activity happening. Or I can tap into your Bluetooth and see that you're surrounded by a lot of other people. I can check your credit card and again see that you're hanging out at concerts and bars. Or I can look at your social media where you talk about the fun weekend that you've had. So instead of asking you all these questions, I can just literally follow your footsteps and see what you've been up to.
what do you say to people who I'm sure often hear you say that and say that feels really creepy? It
I
does.
would say that's absolutely correct.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I do think there is, it feels incredibly intrusive, right? So the fact that someone just purely based on the digital footprints that we leave can make inferences about are you extroverted, introverted? Not just that, we can learn about your mental health, like your sexual orientation, whether you're neurotic or not, whether you're impulsive or not. So there's so many things that we can learn that are incredibly intimate. And I think it's absolutely right to be worried that this is not only possible, but it's also used by companies to then not just peek into your psychology, but potentially also use it to change the choices that you make.
Right. Yeah, that's what we're going to get to because
Mm,
up until now, it's been sort of identify a kind of generic profile of
yeah,
someone, a
mhm.
customer or a voter, and then send them from a selection of messages. Now, I think we're talking about much more individualized and
Yeah,
the ability because they're interacting with us, not just taking
exactly.
information in. There is now this feedback loop where we're actually able to influence behavior.
Yeah.
Is that am I? Could you just tell us
Very
a little bit
much.
about how that works?
And so for me, the interesting part is, in a way, that's been the case. Like, right, if you think about how did old school communication work, the salesperson was trying to figure out who's on the other side, make inferences about their preferences and psychology, and then adjust their communication to that. Now, fast forward, we're trying to replicate in a way the same thing online. We're taking your data, like those are the observations of the salesperson. We're turning it into insights and intelligence, and then we're using that intelligence to customize the pitch that we have, the content that we show, and so on. And again, AI has just put this on steroids because you can automate the entire process all the way from here's the interactions that I see with a customer to, okay, now that I know who person X is, let me come up with a perfect messaging, with a perfect image to go with. And then based on my interactions with this content, I can optimize even further, right? So I don't necessarily rely on this initial relatively broad category of he's extroverted or introverted, but I can fine tune and zoom in even more.
Yeah. And you talk even about at the individual level. Now we can even get more granular because before your coffee, you were a different person than after the
Yeah.
coffee. And so tell us about, because I've always been intrigued by that, that I
Yeah.
have felt that my father's a communications professor. And I remember one thing that he wrote about was just that we have these different identities that
Yeah.
in the morning, I'm a commuter.
Mm.
In the afternoon, I'm a coworker. In the evening, I'm a husband or, so talk to us a little bit because I have not seen people really kind of dig into the fact that we have multiple eyes and multiple identities.
Yeah. And for me, that's one of the interesting new developments in personality psychology. So it used to be the case that we think of personality as something that is relatively static, right? So even if you have the multiple identities, usually it's just a puzzle that, okay, every morning you have this identity. And it was rare that those identities clashed, right? So
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes it's true, we can act out of character. So if you're generally really introverted, and your job requires you to be extroverted, you can totally do that, but it typically takes a toll. Now, what we do know is that people are much more dynamic based on the context, right? So it's even if you're very introverted generally, if you're surrounded by a lot of other people or you engage in like an activity that's kind of social and it's exciting, most of us feel more extroverted in that moment than we typically do. So the way that personality psychologists think of personality right now, it's as a distribution of states. So instead of having a one-time measure that says you're the 80th percentile on extroversion, we can sample, let's say, we can ask you 100 times over the course of 4 weeks, how extroverted do you feel right now? Like how social do you feel right now? And we will get this
Mm-hmm.
distribution that still tells us something about your general tendency, right? Because the mean of that distribution is essentially, on average, if I don't know anything about the context that you're in, you're like somewhat on the 80th percentile. But then I also know that, well, maybe currently he's like surrounded by friends, he's like at this concert and he's having a really good time. So maybe I'm going to adjust my estimate and say maybe right now it's the 85th percentile. Chances that you're ever going to be the 10th percentile is still very slim, right? You kind of have to be confined to solitary, like not seeing anyone for multiple days to maybe feel that way. But we get a sense that says, okay, here's how you generally behave, but also allowing for this dynamic adjustment based on context and situation.
Fascinating. Fascinating, yeah. And I wonder, I don't know if I read this in your book or not, but it's just a thought is, as more of our interactions are less with physically with other people, but digitally with other people or digitally by ourselves, I would think, at least for myself, that my variance is wider when I am not with other people.